From lights, camera, action! To flank me on my 6th officer, this badass from history has one of the most interesting and varied pasts. His mindset and true heroics on the battlefield, as well as on screen, have etched his name in British history. An actor, model, piper, swordsman and soldier, fighting Jack Churchill is the subject of today's episode. We find ourselves in Sri Lanka on the 16th of September 1906, where Alec Churchill was stood close to his wife Eleanor Elizabeth, anxiously watching his newborn baby let out his first scream. His pride could be felt as he brushed the hairs from his wife's face. He was a beautiful child, Alec thought, thanking his father for the strong Churchill genes that coursed through his body. The boy was destined for greatness. He had to give him a great name to match. He christened him Jack. Alec hated the fact they were in Sri Lanka for this. He wanted to be home around their families. He liked his job, but it sent him to all these different parts of the world. He decided then and there to pick up and move back to Surrey, where they were blessed with a brother for Jack, Thomas Churchill. After a few moves around the world to places like Hong Kong, where a third Churchill was born, a Robert Churchill, the family then decided to return once and for all to England. Churchill's strive for greatness started from a young age, as he joined the King William's College on the Isle of Man, where he graduated from the RMC in Sandhurst at the age of 20. He joined the Manchester Regiment, which was a line infantry regiment of the British Army in existence from 1881 all the way to 1958. Jack's free spirit and love of the outdoors was clear immediately to all who came in contact with him. Jack was bored. Nothing was happening. They did the same thing day in, day out. They stationed him in Burma. He loved his regiment and his mates. He didn't think of them as soldiers. They were his mates. They all seemed content to follow the same duties every day, sitting down to read their books or newspapers in the downtime, occasionally having the odd drink. Jack loved his Norton 16H motorbike. He loved its ruggedness and dependability. It was pretty quick and looked slick. Churchill rode that bike at every chance he could. He developed a few different hobbies during his time stationed in Burma. He really did have a lot of downtime, and he was incredibly bored. One of the Manchesters was a piper from Scotland. He introduced Jack to the bagpipes. He picked it up immediately and instantly felt it was the best thing that he had ever laid his hands on. He played those bagpipes day in, day out, impressing his fellow Manchesters. During his time stationed in Burma, he picked up any course he could. One such course was available to him one day, a signalling course that was available in Pune. The issue here was Churchill was in Rangoon, a 1,500-mile distance. Others who were taking the training course chose to travel by boat. Not Jack, however. He had his trusty Norton. He picked up his bagpipes, his essentials, and he jumped on his bike. Wind rushed through Jack's hair as he revved his bike, accelerating on the dirt road, picking up a tremendous speed. He felt the adrenaline tingle as he twisted the handlebar, every ounce of the bike's 3.5 gallons pushing him forward. He took a moment to appreciate the surroundings. The views on the road were truly spectacular. He breathed in the summer air. He stopped his travels every day or so to camp out and regroup, relying on the local environment for food and shade. On one of those days he stopped off in a remote area in Patna, by an offshoot of the Ganges. He was camped out and he had begun to relax. He lay on his back and looked up at the sky. It was clear. It was serene and beautiful. In the distance he heard a heavy object disturb the water. He didn't look around, as this was India, the land of 1 billion people, and probably more animals. The usual rule with animals is, don't annoy them, and they will usually leave you alone. He focused more on the stars, imagining the worlds that could be out there. We surely can't be alone, he thought. He heard pounding on the ground in the distance, and yet again didn't look around. The pounding got louder. This piqued his interest, and he sprung up. In the night he saw 2 glinting eyes running at full pelt towards him. In a panic he dived for his Enfield revolver, loaded and ready. He didn't get it in time, and the water buffalo clipped his leg as it ran past. He stood, holding his revolver, leg bleeding all over the floor as the buffalo stopped in the dirt, ready to turn around and charge again. He emptied the chamber at the buffalo, bringing it to its knees immediately. Taking deep breaths to calm his nerves, he assessed the situation at hand. He was alive, and now he had food for the next few days. All was well. He bandaged up his knee and began working on the buffalo. Having made it to Poona and sat through the signalling course, he received the order to report to Calcutta in a few days as trouble was brewing. Yet again, instead of taking the boat transportation offered, Jack took his motorcycle, pushing it across watercourses by using a rail and walking on the cross ties. Unusual and hazardous situations never really meant much to Churchill. He was one of those human beings that was born to lead others, to always seek the challenge. He rode his bike as fast as he possibly could. Riding on completely unpaved roads made this difficult. He made it. He joined his unit and was ready to be part of the Burma Rebellion, which took place between 1930 to 1932. After a few years following the rules and doing what he was told, his boredom grew and grew. His distaste for authority and status quo got him into trouble quite a few times. On one occasion it was reported that during a normal parade, where soldiers were expected to stand completely still, come rain or shine, Jack Churchill came out with a giant black umbrella, covering his head from the pelting rain. He stood in line, completely still, with a complete poker face expression on his face. The battalion adjutant marched straight over to him as quickly as possible, anger brimming, face completely red from the stinging cold. He got right into Jack's face and screamed at him to explain his outlandish behaviour. Churchill replied in an extremely calm demeanour, "It's raining, sir." The anger that was unleashed on him at that moment rivaled a world war. This hatred for leadership and genuine boredom in a job he thought would bring him nothing but constant challenges led to his resignation after 10 years of service. He took a position as an editor in the Nairobi paper. His co-workers told of how he showed genuine flair for the position. It therefore came as no shock to them at all when one day Churchill simply handed in his resignation and walked away. He had always been told he was a handsome devil. He never paid it any heed, as he thought it was just niceties older women would say to win favour with the younger men. The thought, however, lingered in his head as he thought about positions he could take. Modelling, now that's a thought. He applied to and booked a few roles as a model in the Odd magazine. He also began working as an extra alongside greats such as Robert Taylor. It was on such occasion where he was supposed to play his bagpipe in the back of shot as an extra when one of the men who was intended to pull the bow oar on the film A Yank at Oxford had injured his arm and could not do it. They asked for a replacement and Jack volunteered, expressing his experience with boats in the army. They agreed, and he had an on-screen cameo as a boatman in the Oxford shell. Jack's determination to be the very best at anything that grabs his attention led him to victory at the officers' class of the piping championship in the summer of 1938. This may seem like a somewhat localized event, but it was actually a brilliant feat as he was the only Englishman to compete amongst the 70 competitors. After feeling like he was completely proficient at the bagpipes, another hobby piqued his interest: archery. Naturally, given his nature, he gravitated towards this hobby with such ferocity he medalled in the World Championships in Oslo in 1939. His skill with the bow and arrow and his experience in acting led to him landing a few different roles in movies, such as the Sabu in The Thief from Baghdad. During all these exploits, the ugly truth of war raged on in Europe, and the UK was beginning to get more and more involved. Jack kept a close eye on the situation and stayed abreast of any developments.
The following official communique has been issued from 10 Downing Street. On September the 1st, His Majesty's Ambassador in Berlin was instructed to inform the German government that unless they were prepared to give His Majesty's government in the United Kingdom satisfactory assurances that the German government had suspended all aggressive action against Poland and were prepared promptly to withdraw their forces from Polish territory, His Majesty's government in the United Kingdom would, without hesitation, fulfill their obligations to Poland.
One such development piqued his interest. The invasion of Poland by German forces stirred anger and vitriol within Churchill. He immediately re-enlisted in the British Army, back with the Manchester Regiment. He was quickly shipped off to France to aid their forces on the front line. He was later quoted as saying, "I was back in my red coat, the country having got into quite a jam in my absence." Although he joked about his place in the British Army, it was immediately clear to him that he had to fight for his position to be respected. They posted him on a quiet stretch of France during the pre-Blitz Sitzkrieg of 1940. He hated that position. He simply had to patrol up and down, day in, day out. He felt that dreaded sense of boredom. He was a free spirit, a warrior. He needed to be on the battlefield. He knew why they had stationed him here, and he simply got on with it. Waiting for his opportunity to prove himself. Such an opportunity arose as a force was needed to assist the Finnish army when they were under attack by the Soviet Red Army. He and a few other notable names such as Mike Calvert were ready to go, packed and prepared for the inevitable madness that would follow. That expedition never took place, as it was cancelled before they left. His eagerness and willingness to die for his country did not go unnoticed. This act of bravery led to him being promoted to second in command of an infantry company in the regiment's 2nd Battalion. So when the German war machine turned its head towards Holland, Belgium and France, he was ready. He bobbed up and down, focusing his eyes on his sword, holding it by the hilt while pointing the tip at the floor. His regiment thought it was strange for him to carry that weapon with him into battle. He not only took the sword but also had the bow on his back. The sound of gunfire got louder and louder as the patrol vessel approached the coast. He knew they were close. He ran through the intel in his head, sketching out a map of what he was going to expect when they docked. He was always first out. He led his men, sword in hand, shouting orders at the top of his lungs. He knew the power this image had on his soldiers. They were completely fresh and properly scared when it came to this. He enjoyed it. He lived for it. He was asked about his sword by his general. "Why do you carry it?" they asked Churchill. He replied, "In my opinion, sir, any officer who goes into action without his sword is improperly dressed." With a thud, the patrol vessel docked and he heard the driver shout, "Dismount!" The door began to open, and before it hit the sea floor, Churchill was already clambering to get out, sword in hand and bow on back. The sight before him looked nothing like they had described. The positions were wrong. Why on earth could he see Germans so close? They are far too close. His Kleibeg, the name given to his Scottish sword, led the way as he waded through the water as quickly as possible, running towards his fellow Brits. The Blitzkrieg was in full effect. Hitler had launched his lightning war against Holland and Belgium. They had invaded and completely levelled Rotterdam. This occupation was brutal. The wake of their destruction and hatred was clear to all who looked in. Britain and France had declared war on Germany in anticipation. Neville Chamberlain, the Prime Minister at the time, declared war. He was later ousted as his vision was simply not clear enough. We cut to May in 1940. The Battle of France had been raging for a while at this point. British, Belgian and French troops were completely cut off and surrounded by German troops. The British Expeditionary Force, or BEF, was amongst the troops that were stranded in the north of France as the Germans pressed on towards the English Channel. Army Group A, led by Gerd von Rundstedt, had completely annihilated the French and British forces. They didn't have many options remaining. This lack of options led General Viscount Gort to command his BEF forces to retreat towards Dunkirk for the inevitable retreat across the English Channel. Mad Jack was part of the BEF. During this retreat, Churchill took command of his company when the company commander was wounded. He led his company in the fighting, often charging in, sword out. On one occasion it was reported that he plunged his sword deep into another German soldier, almost lifting him off the floor in the same motion. Churchill was as vicious as he was cunning with his actions. He was a true badass. Shots pinged off the floor around him. He ducked, giving them less of a target, he thought, as he pulled the handle on the bike, the German soldier's hat flapping in the wind as he accelerated. He'd attached it to his bike. He rode across the Flanders quickly, not stopping for anything. He glanced down at his bow. Did I fasten that properly? He thought. He was riding through active fire, and that was his main concern. A giant grin came across his face as he spotted his friend across the Flander. "Ah!" he shouted. "Hello, Clark. Got anything to drink?" Churchill leaped off his bike, now safely behind friendly lines. He wiped the dirt off his forehead as he began to untie his belongings from the bike. "Is that blood on your ear there?" asked Clark, pointing at Churchill's head. "Yeah, German machine gun," Churchill replied, grin still fixed to his face. Clark couldn't believe how matter-of-fact Jack was about the wound on his face. That's why they call him Mad Jack, he thought. A story surfaced about Churchill. He had fought tooth and nail, and his bravery was recognised with a military cross. The story goes that a British tank was completely out of commission, as it had broken down due to a well-timed 13.2mm round from a German Mauser had found its way to the engine block, completely disabling it. While the rest of the troops around were ready to ditch the tank and retreat, Jack wasn't. He got out and assessed the situation. He saw they had 6 trucks fully working and ready to go, and quite a bit of chain link too. He hitched all 6 trucks to the tank and told every driver to accelerate together. They moved the tank a few feet, but the trucks also got stuck. All of the drivers then decided to leave the tank and drive off. Churchill couldn't do that. He got out and used one of the trucks he had been driving to go back for a wounded British soldier who was lying on the floor, bleeding out. He saved that man's life, risking his own to do so. Churchill was known for these antics. He was renowned for being completely fearless. He would go out for a counter-strike operation, hand-picking his team to go out with him. He would often pick men with the same temperament and mindset as him. Their missions were often successful. After sending all his men to Dunkirk to be picked up, Churchill stayed behind looking for any survivors. He found a few men that he also helped make it back to Dunkirk for pickup. After he did all he could, he was seen riding back to Dunkirk on a bicycle, his famed bow and arrow hanging from the frame. He could be seen pedalling casually across the beach, looking almost lackadaisical in his approach. He and his Manchester regiment were picked up by one of the many boats that were dispatched to pick them up. On the way back to England, an officer sidled up to him and told him about a new organisation being formed that he might be perfect for. Jack listened intently, trying to focus on this man's soft voice as the ship crashed through the waves. "You would be commando. You to win wars." Jack heard all he needed to hear. He was promised aggressive service, and that was right up Churchill's street. Churchill took to being a commando like a duck to water. He loved the hills, the mud, the dirt, and the hostility of it all. He was also incredibly good at lecturing newer recruits. He was known for his ability to speak to them like he was one of them. "There's nothing worse than sitting on your bum, doing nothing just because the enemy happens to leave you alone for a minute while he has a go at the unit on your flank. Pitch in and support your neighbour any way you can." The commandos' training all paid off when they set out on a planned assault on the German garrison Vagsow. Churchill was in charge of 2 companies. Churchill led the way, standing at the lead landing craft as it forged its way towards shore. Picture this. Churchill was also playing his pipe as they approached, sword in its hilt. He was playing the march of the Cameron men. To describe the scene of Churchill charging forward, I read you a quote by one of the troops in his company. "Into the thick smoke he ran, uttering warlike cries. They killed or took prisoner the garrison. Churchill's signal to the raid commander went like this: Molloy battery and island captured. Casualties slight, demolitions in progress. Churchill." This mission to Molloy was so incredibly successful, the commandos had really stung the Germans. They had completely demolished the German garrison at Vagsow. They had also taken nearly 100 prisoners of war. They had also sunk nearly 15,000 tons of ships. but most importantly, they had destroyed the fish oil plants that were so incredibly dear to Germans as they relied on them for ammunition production and for dietary supplements. This unbelievably successful raid at Molloy had left its scar on Churchill, however, as he had been wounded by a British demolition charge which accidentally exploded next to him. Churchill later joked about the wound, saying, "I had to touch it up from time to time with Rosamund's lipstick to keep the wounded hero story going." It was not all glowing stories for Churchill, however, as the battle at Salerno proves. He was commanding the No. 2 Commando. The ferocious Salerno fighting led to a lot of casualties as they were extremely underprepared for the madness that would ensue. The British forces were joined by the Rangers from the American forces, who were also not prepared for the kind of fighting they had to do. They all found themselves fighting as line infantry. Their casualties were heavy, but they managed to beat back every German attack. The silver lining, however, in this darkest of clouds, was the night raid they carried out on Pigoletti. Churchill's ingenious strategy led to them reaching all their objectives. What he did was organize all of his commandos into 6 parallel columns and instructed them to charge, screaming "Commando" with all they have. The logic behind this was that heavy undergrowth ruled out any chance of a silent attack, which they had been trained to do. The shouting also served to confuse the German soldiers in the dark, as it felt like the commandos were coming from all directions, surrounding them. The shouting also had another purpose. It stopped friendly fire from fellow commandos who would not be able to see them in the dark. This worked so well, they ended up bagging 136 prisoners and taking the position. Churchill himself was far in front of his troopers, sword in hand, accompanied only by a corporal named Ruffel. He advanced into the town itself, undiscovered by the enemy. He and Ruffel heard German soldiers digging in all around them in the gloom. The glow of a cigarette in the darkness told them the location of a German sentry post. What followed, even Churchill later admitted, was a bit Errol Flynnish. The first German sentry post, manned by 2 men, was taken in silence. Jack Churchill, his sword blade gleaming in the night, appeared like a demon from the darkness, ordered "Hand, hosh!" and got results. He gave 1 German prisoner to Ruffel, then slipped his revolver lanyard around the second sentry's neck and led him off to make the rounds of the other guards. Each post, lulled into a sense of security by the voice of their captive comrade, surrendered to their fearsome apparition with the ferocious moustache and the naked sword. Altogether, Churchill and Corporal Ruffel collected 42 prisoners, complete with their personal weapons and a mortar they were manning in the village. Churchill and his claymore took the surrender of 10 men in a bunch around the mortar. He and his NCO then marched the whole lot back into the British lines. On May 1944, Churchill's luck had run out. Attacks were planned on the Yugoslav island of Brač, as it was German-held. While partisan attacks on the main German position got nowhere, 43 Royal Marine Commandos were sent to the attack on the vital hill called Point 66. Pushing ahead in clear moonlight through wire and minefields, 43 Commando carried the hilltop, but was forced to fall back with heavy casualties. Churchill now sent 40 Commando, also Royal Marines, in against the hill, and led them himself, playing the pipes. The leading troop went in, yelling, shouting from the hip, and overran the German positions on 622. But between casualties on the way up the hill, and more casualties from very heavy German fire on the top, Churchill quickly found himself isolated with only a handful of defenders around him. There were only 6 commandos on the hilltop, and 3 of those were wounded, 2 of them very badly. "I was distressed," said Churchill, with memorable understatement, "to find that anyone was armed with revolvers except myself, who had an American carbine." Still, the little party fought on until the revolver ammunition was gone and Churchill was down to a single magazine for his carbine. A German mortar round killed 3 of his little party and wounded still another, leaving Churchill as the only unwounded defender on the hilltop. It was the end. Churchill turned to his pipes, playing "Will Ye, No Come Back Again," until German grenades burst in his position and he was stunned by a fragment from one of them. He regained consciousness to discover German soldiers prodding him, apparently looking to discover if he was alive. Long after the end of the war, Churchill was pleased to hear that the German account of the fighting for the hill described his lonely piping as the doleful sound of an unknown musical instrument. He and his surviving men escaped killing by the Gestapo under Hitler's foul commando order through the chivalry of one Captain Thurner of the Wehrmacht. "You are a soldier, as I am," the captain told Churchill. "I refuse to allow these civilian butchers to deal with you. I shall say nothing of having received this order." After the war, Churchill was able to personally thank Thurner for his decency and to help him stay out of the merciless hands of the Russians. Churchill spent some time in solitary confinement, and in time he ended up in a concentration camp. That infamous prison was only one more challenge to Churchill, however, and in September 1944, he and an RAF officer crawled under the wire through an abandoned drain and set out to walk to the Baltic coast. Their luck was not in, however, and they were recaptured near the coastal city of Rostock, only a few miles from the sea. In time, they were moved to a camp in Neudorf, Austria. Here, Churchill watched for another opportunity to escape, keeping a small rusty can and some onions hidden in his jacket, in case a sudden opportunity should present itself. On an April night in 1945, it did. The chance came when the camp's lighting system failed. Churchill seized the moment and walked away from a work detail, disappearing into the darkness and heading for the Alps and the Italian frontier. Liberating vegetables from Austrian gardens and cooking them in his tin can, he walked steadily south, keeping off the roads. He crossed the Brenner Pass into Italy and headed for Verona, some 150 miles away. On the 8th day of his escape, hobbling along on a sprained ankle, Churchill caught sight of a column of armoured vehicles. To his delight, their hulls carried the unmistakably white star of the United States Army. He managed to flag down one vehicle and persuade the crew that in spite of his scruffy appearance he was indeed a British colonel. As he later told his old friend and biographer, Rex King Clark, "I couldn't walk very well, and so out of breath I could scarcely talk, but I still managed a credible Sandhurst salute, which may have done the trick."
Yesterday morning at 2:41 a.m. at General Eisenhower's headquarters, General Jodl, the representative of the German High Command, and of Grand Admiral Dönitz, the designated head of the German state, signed the act of unconditional surrender of all German land, sea, and air forces in Europe to the Allied expeditionary forces and simultaneously to the Soviet High Command. Hostilities will end officially at 1 minute after midnight tonight, Tuesday, the 8th of May.
Churchill was free, but frustrated. The European war was almost over, and he had missed much of it, including the chance for further promotion and perhaps the opportunity to lead a commando brigade. Nevertheless, hope sprang eternal. "However," he said to his friends, "there are still the Nips, aren't there?" There were, and so Churchill was off to Burma, where the largest land war against Japan was still raging. Here too, however, he met frustration, for by the time he reached India, Hiroshima and Nagasaki had disappeared in a mushroom cloud, and the war abruptly ended. For a warrior like Churchill, the end of the fighting was bittersweet. "You know," he said to a friend only half joking, "if it hadn't been for those damned Yanks, we could have kept the war going for another 10 years. After World War II ended, he qualified as a parachutist and transferred to the Seaforth Highlanders, and later ended up in Palestine as second in command of 1st Battalion, the Highland Light Infantry, and it was there in the spring of 1948, just before the end of the British Mandate over that troubled land, that he again risked his life for other people. Those were dangerous days, with much blood, Jewish, Arab and British, shed by Arab terrorists and by Jewish radicals, notably the so-called Stern Gang. On a day in May, a Jewish medical convoy, ambulances, trucks and buses, was ambushed by Arabs on a narrow street in Jerusalem, not far from a small HLI detachment at a place called Tony's Post. Churchill rushed to the site in a dingo, a small armoured car. This one had its turret removed for repair, but it gave him a semblance of protection at least. Accurately assessing the potential for mass murder by the Arab terrorists, he radioed for 2 staghounds, heavy cannon-armed armoured cars, and they were diverted from convoy protection and dispatched to him. It would take time for the armoured cars to reach him, however, and while they were on their way, Churchill acted. He drove down to the Bellegarde convoy in a large armoured personnel carrier, covered by the only escort available, an open-topped Bren gun carrier, and a small police armed car armed with a machine gun. Leaving his tiny convoy and swinging a walking stick, he walked calmly into the open and down the road to the convoy. Marching into the teeth of the battle, around the convoy, he must have been quite a sight, since he had just come from a battalion parade. He was resplendent in full dress, kilt, Glengarry bonnet, red and white dice stockings, Sam Brown belt and white spats. And as usual, he later made light of this extraordinary cold courage. "I grinned like mad from side to side," he said afterwards, "as people are less likely to shoot at you if you smile at them. That outfit in the middle of the battle, together with my grinning at them, may have made the Arabs laugh, because most of them have a sense of humour. Anyway, they didn't shoot at me." Churchill spoke to the occupants of one bus and offered to drive his big armoured personnel carrier down to the convoy and make as many trips as necessary to evacuate the patients with their medical personnel. He warned those at the convoy that there might be casualties when they moved to the British vehicle, and one of the Jews asked whether he would not first drive off the Arabs. He patiently explained he could not. There were hundreds of Arabs, and he had only 12 men. After a discussion with one of the doctors, as Churchill stood in the open, his offer was refused. "Thank you very much, but we do not want your help. The Haganah will save us." Those were Jewish defense forces. Churchill walked down the convoy repeating his offer, but was uniformly refused. By now, one of Churchill's men had been mortally wounded, and he ran back to his vehicles and sent them out of harm's way. Returning to Tony's post, he supported the Jewish convoy with small arms fire until Arab gasoline bombs and rifle fire destroyed the Jewish vehicles and most of their passengers. The Haganah had not arrived to save them after all, and 77 Jews died in the narrow street. Churchill was a flamboyant man. In his later years, passengers on a London commuter train were often startled by seeing an older male passenger rise, open a window, and hurl his briefcase out into the night. The passenger would then leave the car and wait by the train's door until it stopped at the next station. It was Churchill, of course, enjoying this little gesture, and reasonably sure that his fellow passengers could not know he had thrown the case into the garden of his house. It saved him carrying it home from the station. Churchill spent his last years before retirement teaching and training cadets in the London district. Churchill died peacefully in the spring of 1996 at his home in Surrey, surrounded by his family and his wife. He left a legacy of daring that survives to this day. That's the story of Mad Jack Churchill, a man born to be a warrior. Please follow me on Twitter, on Badasses History, and on Instagram, Badasses from History. Please share so we can grow this podcast. Thank you.